Welcome back to Freedom Families. Today we have Peter Kapsner with us. Peter is a professor. He has his PhD in practical theology. He also is often heard on Faith Radio, which is where I first started listening to Peter, I would say 2 years ago. Peter, do you remember how long ago it was that you first started either coming on as a guest or helping out with Faith Radio?
Yeah, it was about 4 years ago. I went to a meeting at Faith Radio to actually talk with Bill Arnold about some things. He's the afternoon host at Faith Radio. We were about 7 minutes into our meeting, and he literally, he couldn't take any longer meeting than that. And he stood up and he said, well, it smells like we have some fresh meat here. And he dragged me over to the recording studio and immediately recorded a 30-minute episode on sexuality that was to air the next day. So I'd had some broadcasting experience with the Minnesota Twins Network prior to that and some other things that I had done, but that was my first go at Faith Radio. And that led to about 9 months later, I was the full-time morning show host from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock every morning for about 9 months. I couldn't keep that deal up, though, because I was waking up early and we've got 5 kids at home. I would teach afterwards. And by about noon, right, each day, I had absolutely nothing left. So I had to give up either the classroom or radio. And as much as it killed me to give up radio, I stayed in the classroom. And now I'm the backup host for the different shows and then just regularly appear, as you referenced. So yeah, it's been a great journey. I've loved being part of it.
Fun for me to hear. I think I first heard you, correct me if I'm wrong, you would go on with Bill as well as Jim Bilby. You guys did a show. Okay, that's where I think I first started hearing you on the radio. And for our listeners, if you're not familiar with Faith Radio, it is our local radio station out of the University of Northwestern in St. Paul, Minnesota. And you can listen to it on your local radio station if you're around here. And I know they have some other affiliate stations in, I think, the Dakotas and even one out east. But you can also download the Faith Radio app or go online to My Faith Radio and find it there. I definitely recommend listening to it. I listen every day. And and Peter's on there. I think you're taking over for Carmen next week and the following week.
Yeah, it's right? Actually starting the first week after Memorial Day, the first full week. So it's about 2 weeks in June. Yeah, I'll handle the morning show again for a couple of weeks. So it'll be really fun to be back. It is the guests that we get a chance to talk with from around the country just have such great perspective, and then a few weeks later it'd be really nice to sleep in again.
Yeah.
But it's a great show. Carmen does a great job on the show, and it really is delightful to be a part of it.
I also get a lot of my book recommendations from Faith Radio, whether it's Carmen or Susie Larson or Bill Arnold. They always have great authors on who are coming out with great books. I end up buying way more books than I'm able to read at one time, but they have so many great guests on with books that I think are worth reading.
They do. And, and the guests that they have on, EJ, they are the kind of guests that have stayed faithful to the Bible as a place of an authoritative reference in our lives. And not all Christian organizations have done that. And so it's been fun behind the scenes at Faith Radio to see faithful people working as they do. And I wouldn't want to be a part of a ministry where there's not that sense of integrity behind the scenes that is consistent with what's being demonstrated in public. So the authors they choose, the topics that they choose, the fact that they pray for every listener that writes in with a prayer request. Again, all of this is happening in the anonymity of the background. And it's a really sweet place to be. So I have a hard time sometimes advocating for certain Christian ministries just because it can get dodgy at times. And my 25 years of ministry experience has taught me that. But it's also taught me there's some lovely and beautiful people that really do authentically care about bringing God's kingdom to bear in the tough stuff in our world. So
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because as a listener, I have definitely picked up on that. And I've also noticed that just as you mentioned, the integrity of the radio station and the adherence to biblical principles, values, truths, and not shying away from the difficult, hard, divisive topics, but also going at them with compassion in the way that I believe Christ wants us to, with both truth and love, not forgetting either one of those.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And again, that's what they care about. There's a mindset that they aren't there to build their own personal brand, right? And so many people that are in media because they're there to build their personal brand. Whereas in this case, it is, how do we not shy away from the difficult topics, but as you just said, stay faithful to the truth of them, but then handle things with the grace required of the fact that we are fallen people. And and we don't measure up to the truth that we know is true. But thank goodness, then you have the abounding grace of God that meets us in those places. And I think Faith Radio does a great job of representing just that.
That's right. I wanted to ask you kind of a fun question at the beginning because I know that you are a sports fan and you even used to cover the Timberwolves or do some writing for NBA.com. But to
Yep.
flip it to my favorite sport, which is baseball, I'd say baseball or tennis. Tennis is my favorite to play. Baseball is my favorite to watch. And earlier in this season, the Astros visited Yankee Stadium to a stadium full of booze and signs. And so my question to you is, should we still be holding the grudge that we do against the Astros cheating a couple World Series ago? Should they have had a harsher punishment for the organization and the players and the coaches? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if we take it outside of the sports realm for a second, and when it talks just generally about holding grudges, right? I don't think that we're ever called to hold a grudge. I think that relationships can only be reconciled when both parties want to come to the table. And in that case, when the Astros apologized for sort of their trash can scandal, where they were banging on the trash cans and
Mhm.
maybe even wiring each other up to get the signs and steal the signals with center field cameras, all of that, right?
Mhm.
Um, their apology, at least outside looking in, without trying to judge the heart of the apology, it felt mealy mouthed at best. And
Mhm.
so, in light of that, and then taking it out of the context of real life and putting it in the context of sports, I, EJ, I think they should be booed for 20 years at this point, right? I mean, that's part of the fun of sports. That's
Yeah,
part of the fun of the rivalry, right?
I agree.
And it can be good natured. You don't have to have a hateful heart about it, but, have at it. Just have a good
Mhm.
time taking them down.
Well,
So
even
it is
yeah,
enjoyable to watch.
the Yankees Red Sox, their rivalry, that's part of the fun, right? To be able to
Totally.
be a Red Sox fan and when the Yankees come to town, you boo. That's what you do.
That's no, my wife and I had a chance to go to old Yankee Stadium on a Sunday afternoon when the Red Sox were in town.
Oh wow.
I have never experienced a stadium like that stadium in terms of the energy. And it was just so, all of that plays into sports rivalries. And I just love that part of it. So, yeah, indeed.
You mentioned that you and your wife Hallie have
Yeah.
5 kids. So, as we talk today about marriage, sex, and children, when you guys were first dating, when you were married, how did those conversations go? How did you approach, our we know we want to have 5 kids. We are just gonna kind of see what happens. How did you guys approach your view of marriage and of kids?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know you have 3 boys from what I understand, right?
Yep, three and
So,
under.
so
Mhm.
and three and
Yeah.
under. Oh, brother, I love that. I love that. I can't say, EJ, that we set out and said, so here is our plan for life. We're going to go ahead and make sure we get an apartment with a cat or a dog, and then we're going to graduate to a townhome and then to a house and then start rattling off kids, right? Like we
Mhm.
just didn't have that part of the plan. And I'd like to say that we set out and had a real plan about how many kids we wanted to have, and that was just sort of part of a experience where we would not necessarily lean into God, just decide how many kids that we wanted. But then it became pretty apparent that we didn't know if I could have kids, and so we skimmed across the surface of what is really painful for a lot of people, where they're unable to have children, and tasted a little bit of that. And unfortunately, I don't think we have a lot of great teaching in the church about what's involved with that. I think we do people a lot of disservice when we say if they just pray in the right way or pray Hannah's prayer, then God will open the womb. Some of these things that maybe could be a topic for a different time. But about 5 years in, after not being terribly careful about trying or not trying to have kids, all of a sudden we got pregnant.
Mm.
And that was a surprise I mean, we knew how it happened, right? But it was a surprise for us that
Yeah.
we got pregnant. And I was in the middle of seminary at the time. And so we had a lot of questions about how do we provide and all of that. And that just led to having more kids. And I'll tell you what, EJ, with every child, I always wondered, you do have to divide up your time, but you don't divide up your heart. And it's
Mm.
almost like you grow a little spot in your heart for each new kid that comes in. And if we weren't of Abraham and Sarah age right now, we'd probably go to 10 or 12 kids. But five's a great number, and it's been a delightful, difficult. It's all of what people who have kids know what that's about. I mean, it's all of the above, right? It is
Yeah.
the most strenuous job and maybe the most awesome responsibility that we can have on this earth is to raise our kids.
Mm. I like that answer. Of course, we're thinking about that in the stage of life where we are because we're just getting started. And I, I think that our culture and the way that we approach kids, right? You always, oh, how many times we were asked when we were engaged or when we were first married, how many kids do you want or when are you going to start having kids? We by default, even in the church, outside of the church, it's all premised that it's a choice, it's a decision. And that's because of technology, because we have birth control and things like that now. That if you had asked a married woman 100 years ago, how many kids do you want, or when are you going to start having kids, or even the question, are you going to have kids, which is becoming an increasingly more popular question to ask, with so many people choosing not to have kids. If you had asked a married woman 100 years ago, are you going to have kids?
Mm,
I think she'd be very confused. Right? She would
right,
be like, well, yes, unless it just doesn't happen because we're not able to, right?
right.
But our culture seems to kind of look at things very much as a choice. It's just kind of one of the things that you do, like what career are you going to pursue, where are you going to live, and then are you going to have kids? Just one of the things. Whereas I wanted to ask you, as Christians, from a biblical perspective, and how do you think God wants us to be viewing children, as just one of the many things to choose from in the world, like you choose a dog or you choose a cat or things like that? Or is it much different from a biblical perspective?
Yeah, I think you framed that really, really well. And from a biblical standpoint, our primary responsibility from the basis of Genesis 1 in particular, and we see it played out a bit in Genesis 2 as well, is that we are stewards of God's ever unfolding future. Right, the Garden of Eden, the way it was meant to expand and grow and expand and grow, and instead of just living in what God was doing, God gave the human beings, his image bearers on earth, the awesome responsibility to steward that ever unfolding future in partnership with God sort of the
Mhm.
wind at their back and doing that. And part of that, and there's a lot of different ways people can steward, right? And so people that can't have kids can continue to steward God's unfolding future in a variety of ways, just the way they live their lives, how they are in other people's lives, and I think about an uncle and an aunt of a family that I know that they couldn't have kids, but boy, did they steward the future in some
Mhm.
beautiful ways for the people to come. But for those who can have kids, then what we're talking about is something as sacred as the future of God's actual image bearers, the people who have his stamp on this earth. We don't get to see the realities of an invisible God, even though God is real, but we do see God played out among his children. That was the primary purpose of that. And so to treat that sacred responsibility as somehow akin to or in the same category of getting my first job in a law office or as a teacher or something like that, and as you have aptly described, as just another thing we do in life, really diminishes. And
Mhm.
I would say even EJ, it creates a self-centered kind of
Yeah.
reality for parents so often, right? As opposed
Mhm.
to saying, I'm giving my life for the stewarding of the future. These kids are somehow about my own checking off the list about what I want for a fulfilled life. And that is so upside down.
And how did we get here? I know a lot of people point back to the 60s.
Yep,
You could
for sure.
go before that as well, but a lot of people point toward the 60s and then the 70s. Can you walk us kind of through the decades and what things philosophically, ideologically in our culture has led us to where we are now?
Yeah, I can do it really briefly, and I think there's a variety of factors, right? I think the church has not done a great job over the last few generations of teaching what the responsibilities are of male and female in the context of marriage. It's kind of turned into sort of, I've got to find a companion for a lifetime, right? It's not about being called invitationally into a co-stewardship kind of thing. So we already were starting in the 50s and 60s with probably a misunderstanding or entire lack of understanding of what marriage even was. And by the 60s, we saw this incredible counter revolution to any kind of authority structure in our country,
Mhm.
whether it was politics. And of course, the Vietnam War really was that sort of it took a little tinder and turned it into this massive fire of saying that the government just can't be trusted. And then there was this anti-establishment against marriage at that time too. And I think EJ, understandably so on one level, because women had been treated so horribly and really had not been seen as having opportunity in life, or it was just assumed that they should act and be in a certain kind of way. And men treated women terribly. But as what often happens when the pendulum swings the other direction, it might
Mhm.
remedy one thing, but it creates a whole host of new things. And so there got to be this kind of feministic movement that might have helped to remedy some of the treatment of women, not entirely. But what it did is it sort of raged against the family, and it raged against being part of anything other than your own personal opportunity. And what that did then, and combined with sort of the 60s were this first era in which we began to celebrate sex outside of marriage. This was make love, not war, right?
Mhm.
So, and in doing so, the 70s created this culture, then the rippling impact of the 60s turned the 70s into this massive divorce culture where divorce had gone from about 6% to maybe 57% within about 10 years.
It was
And
that low before that,
yeah, it,
6%?
it was historically stable for generations, if not centuries, at 6%. Certainly at 1900, at the turn of the century, it was that number. And when you see something go so crazy statistically like that from one to the next, you have to ask yourself the question, why? Are we getting smarter? Are we getting more enlightened, or something else, happening? And this really, when you bring two people together that are more about themselves moving forward than they are about maybe partnering with somebody in stewardship, and if they have a pretty extensive sexual past now, the covenant of the one flesh marriage is a really tricky place to walk it out if you're not going to go backwards and do the healing work that you need to do, and the humility work, and the surrendering and submission work. It's really hard to have a functioning marriage without having dealt with the realities of the past. And so that led into this tremendous divorce culture that then we could go through all these things that led into the 1980s, where I grew up. And every song, every movie, every TV show was about the freedom of sex, right? This is Prince,
Yeah.
this is Cheers, this is all of these different shows that began to celebrate in tremendous ways the freedom of sexuality. And the parents didn't feel like they had the moral authority anymore to say anything because they had done all the same stuff themselves, right? And
Mhm.
that led to the 1990s, in which it began to the language was, well, of course you're going to have sex, just make sure it's safe sex. And that was some of the birth control distribution in schools, and the whole thing just continued to go to internet pornography, to gender blurring, all of that. And I think in that there's so many things that happen, but probably the most significant thing is that things shifted so quickly that parents, they really lost the role of shepherds in their kids' lives in a variety of ways, and they began to sort of cede the education of their kids to the state. They
Mhm.
began to see that having and developing a vocation somehow was more important than the shepherding of the future with our kids, and kids were almost seen as, well, I just have to find somebody to take care of this little brat so that
Mhm.
I can continue on with my career. And so I mean, that's overly simplified. We'd need a couple hours to kind of talk through all of the psychological and sociological parts of that. But we really did see a shift that kids were more about my own journey than it was about my own journey shepherding the
Mhm.
future. And that shift has been dramatic for the last probably 40 years.
I certainly have seen that as a young woman, that the messaging that I get from the culture is that I will never be fully satisfied if I'm a stay-at-home mom, or
Yep.
even if I work part-time, but I spend a significant amount of time at home. I need to work outside of the home in order to be successful, in order to show that I am a motivated, hardworking person, that stay-at-home moms are miserable and lazy and they don't enjoy it. They wish they were not at home. That is the messaging that I hear. And from what I've read and different things that I've listened to, it sounds like you may know this, that in the 90s, which would be third wave feminism, you started to hear the messaging of you don't need a man. And that
Yeah.
is kind of morphed into almost you don't need a family either. And that you need to pursue a career and you need to pursue, multiple master's degrees and all of these things and get work 80 hours a week so that you can get to the top of whatever organization that you want. And then, all of a sudden you're in your mid, late 30s, maybe you're even in your 40s, and now you're going to start thinking about having a family. And when you look at anxiety, depression, all of those things for the people in those demographics, especially women, we are seeing that this is not working. And so then I go back to scripture and how God seems to be showing us how he's designed us as human beings, since we're made in his image, how he designed marriage, how he designed the family to be. And the further and further we get away from that, it seems like the more miserable we become.
Yeah, I think you again are really spot on a number of things there. I was just with some friends the other night, and we were talking about some of these things and saying that I would say it this way that if I was Satan, right, and I'm glad I'm not, but but if I was, maybe the most strategic and effective attack I could make upon God's beautiful children is to fracture the two stewards, the male and the female. If I could drive a wedge between the two who from Genesis 1 were designed to steward God's unfolding creation, I could create all of the havoc that I would ever want to create if I can just drive that wedge. And so when you look through the context of history, you see that wedge driven in so many different kinds of ways. And you just hit one of them in the 1990s when the messaging began to change, when this toxic brand of individualism, which is I don't need anybody else. My life is about me to realize my own dreams. And when that was met with the very, again, unfortunate historical reality of all of the glass ceilings that were truly in place for women. I mean, women really, I don't think we can overestimate how terribly women were being treated in the workplace and across the board on so many levels. So, but when you greet those glass ceilings with something even potentially worse or as bad in a different way, maybe would be the right way to say it, which is then I don't need a relationship. I'm going to do my own thing. And now you've got this wedge between the male and the female that without intentional kind of coming back together, that wedge is going to remain. And certainly we've seen it with our kids for sure. And so, but the idea that you said in terms of having a vocation of raising our kids, where that's what we do day in and day out. I've watched Hallie do it day in and day out for the better part of 21 years now. My gosh, I run a business. I teach multiple classes. I'm on a radio show. I do all sorts of her job. And this is not patronizing. It is infinitely more difficult in terms of the complexity if you really want to shepherd your children well, in terms of what that requires. And unfortunately, she would also say, because she was a school teacher before we decided to school our kids at home, and she decided to stay home with them. And she was an unbelievably brilliant school teacher in North Minneapolis in a very impoverished community, and was bringing such life and beauty into some really difficult circumstances. And when we would go out to social gatherings, she was always sort of one of the center of the party, right? Everybody wanted to talk to the teacher who would be teaching in North Minneapolis.
Yeah.
And then as soon as she decided that she was going to leave that vocation and shifted for an at-home vocation, guess who never gets talked to at parties anymore? Guess who's like, oh yeah, everybody wants to talk to radio guy and everybody wants to talk to teacher guy. But for her, it's sort of almost seen as this junior varsity career that she chose, that it's so upside down. But this is, you know what, EJ, this is the nature of the fog that Satan creates, is everything gets turned upside down and we can't see it, and we can't see those things that are really important. And I don't know of anything more important than the reestablishment of the family if we want to experience some measure of peace again in our society, because everything is so heated all the time. And if we had more time, I think we could tie that very carefully to the wedging of the stewards that has taken place these last 50 years.
You and I had just briefly talked about the U.S. Census Bureau coming out in December of last year that both marriage rates and divorce rates are declining. And when I had first heard the headline, I had heard just the fact that the divorce rate had declined. And I had immediately thought, okay, there has to be something to this. And then when you looked into it more, it's because people aren't getting married in the first place. So I just want to quickly read the statistic, and then I have a question for you, Peter. So this was from December 7th of 2020, so after the census of 2020 was finished. Both marriage and divorce rates in the United States declined from 2009 to 2019, but rates vary from state to state. In 2019, there were 16.3 new marriages for every 1,000 women 15 and older, down from 17.6 in 2009. At the same time, the U.S. divorce rate fell from 9.7 new divorces per 1,000 women to 7.6. And something that's kind of interesting is they noticed, or I should say the stats bared out, that Wyoming's marriage rate was among the highest in the nation. Delaware's was among the lowest. Arkansas's divorce rate was among the highest, and the divorce rates in the District of Columbia and Maine were the lowest in the nation. And so, my question for you, Peter, is as Christians, since our culture seems to not be valuing marriage or even really trashing marriage, we as Christians, should we value marriage, or is it just, as we mentioned before, a thing that you can decide to do if you want? It's just one of the decisions you make. And then how does God want us to view marriage?
Yeah, boy, that marriage question. I think we have to be really careful to say that for people who don't get married, again, to use the junior varsity example, that they're somehow part of the junior varsity of the kingdom,
Mm-hmm.
right? And sometimes people have been probably to churches where they have singles groups that are meeting, but those singles groups are mostly just sort of Christian sanctioned speed dating groups to try to get people, into the varsity of the kingdom court. And so I know a lot
Yeah.
of single people have felt lesser than as a result of that. And again, for another episode, another show, you can talk all about what life was like in the biblical community among the early Jewish Christians, where single people would not have felt left out because they just lived in an entirely different kind of way together. Now, that said, to not value marriage, now again, we're talking about not valuing the necessity of both male and female to be voices in the unfolding future of the children of our world, of God's image bearers in our world. And it's really clear again from Genesis 1 and 2 that men and women are equal and they are different, and both have been given, however we understand it, they've been given responsibilities to work together in the raising of the children, and that's to happen within the context and the fabric of marriage, where what distinguishes marriage from any other form of relationship is both biblically, and I think we still experience it sometimes today, is that a man and a woman stand across the aisle from one another and they say, here's the deal. No matter what happens in sickness and in health, come hell or high water, it doesn't matter what's going to take place. Here's what I promise you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. And that never leave or never forsake is in the Hebrew of the Old Testament, it's the Hesed love that just says, I'm in this to the end. And what that does, EJ, is it takes all the fear and the uncertainty in theory, right? In theory, it
Mm-hmm.
takes all the fear and the uncertainty off the table. You're not asking questions about the relationship. You have defined the relationship and you're in it for the long haul. And in that place now, you can begin to live this open, beautiful, intimate, vulnerable life with one another, growing in that kind of life that then is the home of peace, again, in theory, in which then the future is growing up, right? The young people, if they're born into the kind of marriage situation where the husband and the wife, though imperfect, are pursuing peace with one another as they're shepherding the kids, now you have the very fragile young people, these image bearers growing into God's kingdom. They have a place of peace in which to grow up. And if you don't have that place of peace in which to grow up, well, now you and I could probably, and anybody listening to this could probably identify 25 different expressions of the lack of peaceful growing up, about how that plays itself out at the age of
Mm-hmm.
15 and 17 or 12 or 22 or 27, and then how that lack of peace perpetrates for generations. That isn't then just about family peace, but now it's about society peace and all kinds of things along those lines. So to not value marriage in the way marriage is meant to be valued biblically, not the way our country thinks of it, but the way the Bible would explain it, would then to not be value society, future, country, any of those sorts of things, because it really is the starting point on the future of all things.
Right. The bedrock of a society, the foundation of a society is the families within it. And if we are going to devalue the family and go along the path of the destruction to nuclear families, then the
Yep.
society is going to break, as we are seeing already, and eventually be non existent. There was another study that came out, a Pew Research study, that asked Christians, and just as a disclaimer, a lot of these studies, when they say Christians, it would just mean that somebody identifies as a Christian. It doesn't really ask further questions about how do they identify as an evangelical, their adherence to the scriptures, things like that. But people who would self identify as Christians, the percentage who believe that cohabitation is not only acceptable, but just a normal way to do things is skyrocketing, as well as the amount of self proclaiming Christians who think that casual sex is perfectly acceptable. Why are we seeing that so much among self identifying Christians? And how can we lovingly, but also with truth, talk to our friends and fellow Christians about both cohabitation and just casual sex, meaning sex outside of a committed relationship, certainly outside of a marriage?
Yeah, there's probably a few different angles that are worth mining, excuse me, into in that. And I would say one of the reasons why, at least as talk with my young people in my classroom, and I teach this sexuality class every semester and have 30 plus students, and they crack open in their papers and kind of talk about how they experience what you just described. And part of it is that they are the offspring, children and grandchildren of the divorced generation, and they're like, we
Hmm.
don't want to do that anymore. Why would we want to get married? Do you have any idea what the house was like that we grew up in? So you're dealing with that kind of
Hmm.
trauma of all of that that doesn't make marriage a favorable word when it's just said because their experience is not favorable. Now, a couple other things that we can say about that is that with marriage, we tend to think of it in our culture as I'm don't want to have a life of loneliness moving forward. So I want to find a companion for a lifetime moving forward. So it's not about stewardship and it's not about
Hmm.
God inviting us into a stewardship thing. It's about I want to find a companion for me. And I don't want to get married to that companion unless I can test them out a little bit. And so we should
Hmm.
probably have a trial run at being
Right.
companions before we get married. And maybe we just don't want the commitment, or we don't. There's a lot of different reasons for that, right? The rise of it. But for both cohabitation and also for sex outside of marriage, and I certainly have heard the troubling anecdotes that young believers are increasingly being told by some of the shepherds of their life to go ahead and kind of try each other out in those ways, living
Hmm.
together sexually to make sure you're compatible on those levels, as if what you're experiencing as a 21-year-old is going to be the same as what you're experiencing when you're 45. I mean, the whole thing's so dumb all the
Yeah.
way from, whatever. So, because I'm sure, I don't know how long you've been married for how long, 5 or 6 years?
Yeah, this is our 6th year.
Yeah, it's
Hmm.
amazing. And I'm sure everything is the exact same as it was 6 years ago, right? Like you were the same exact people, I'm sure.
Hmm.
So it's such a foolish mentality to move into that. It's not well thought through. But as I've counseled couples over the years that decided to have sex before they got married, this goes back into the vows conversation where um, the beautiful union that is the one flesh relationship and in our sexual intimacy and sex is supposed to be about the celebration of intimacy between two covenant people. And if you try to engage in that reality outside of the context of I will never leave you nor forsake you, because sex is so intimate and because sex is we're being touched not just on physical levels but spiritual, emotional, relational, like our deepest core. This is why the Bible says things like it's a great mystery or a sealing of the hearts or
To
um,
know.
to
Hmm.
know. Yeah, and to that word to know has like 500 different connotations to it, and it's not factual knowledge, it is the deep level of the spirit. And I don't know about you, EJ, but in my life I have a lot of armor up in my life when I'm going out and doing the world around me because there's just a lot of fear about what people might
Hmm.
say and people might think. So you kind of learn this armor. You don't trust people very readily. Now take that and enter into what, regardless of what you intend for the sex to be, enter into it without having defined fully the relationship in the context of vows. And now let somebody know you on the most intimate kind of level and have to walk away from that experience like, so did they like it? What does this mean for the relationship? Like all of the crazy
Hmm.
anxiety that happens in that context is so it's a fundamentally and categorically different experience than it's meant to be in the context of vows, where it's a celebration of intimacy without fear. And any couple that I have counseled that decided to engage in sex before marriage, even though they might have gotten married, they struggle mightily with the intimacy part of things because they engaged in something that was just, again, it's different and it's going to wreak a bit of havoc. Now it's redeemable and you can walk through it and all of that. It's a journey
Hmm.
to do so, but we just don't know this stuff, EJ, in the church. So we don't really know how to respond to cohabitation and to sex before marriage because we still don't really even know what the beauty of the one flesh covenant is meant to be between these people. So we kind of turn a blind eye and don't know what to do. And people are really struggling with it.
I think you hit on a great point there. I think in the church we've really dropped the ball because we have forgotten the why. Like, why did God create marriage? Why did God create sex? And because we've lost that, we have the what, like we know what marriage is, we know God wants marriage, and we know that God, made us male and female, but why? We lost that why, and because we lost the why, I think culture is so loud, right?
Yeah.
Culture is so loud. So then when the church is not saying anything on these particular issues, or very little, very surface level things, the culture's narratives, that really seeps in. And then we've gotten to where we are because, well, now I think we're kind of drowning in it. And it's almost like, how do we get out? And I feel like a lot of churches and a lot of pastors, just Christians in general, are choosing to just kind of let it go,
Yeah.
and not really discuss it. Right? It's kind of, it's gotten to the point where I think pastors are almost scared to talk about some of these issues because they know that they are going to be hit with quite a lot of criticism for
Yeah.
speaking out against what has become even almost a Christian norm as well as a cultural norm.
Yeah, you're so right on every level. I will start my sexuality class. And again, I've been teaching this kind of class for about 13 years. I got chucked into it. It's not like I came out of my PhD saying, gosh, I really want to teach a course about sexuality, right? But funny, nobody else seems to want to teach the course. So it seems to have some pretty good job security with it. But the
Yeah.
point of that is that I've had to learn so much. And I was a trained minister with a full master's of divinity, and I knew nothing about any of this stuff when I was working in churches too. And as I talk with my young people, they're like, we might have broken open the box during the week of February 14th as part of a youth group or something, but we do not talk about these things. But to your point, it's not that they haven't been taught. They've been taught by Netflix, and they've been taught by
Right.
pornography, and they've been taught by books that they read, and social media and their friendships. It's just the teachers are so rubbish. And
Mhm.
and so they're hurting and confused, and the voices are very loud. And I don't think that I would be um, over exaggerating and saying that if a church really wants to be a part of reshaping the future on this, there's probably about a 5-year time of a reckoning that the church needs to say yes to, and say, we really have failed. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. I mean, like, shoot, I fail in my life all the time.
Mhm.
Failure is a great teacher, right? So this is not a indictment on the church. It is, we really missed the boat, and we're several iterations of sexuality behind in terms of helping young people know what's going on. In fact, I don't even know that we know for sure what marriage, or the why, like you said, of marriage, and the why of sex. Like, if a church wanted, or a ministry wanted to get serious about it, knowing what it's taken in my class, which is over 14 weeks, about 3.5 hours a week. So it's about 45 hours, a pretty intense time with young people, a lot of Q&A. And even then we get done and we're like, we need another semester of this.
Yeah.
And I think a church would need about 5 years to have a reckoning, to recognize the failure. And it's going to require much more than a 3 or 4 week sermon series for 25 minutes with maybe some YouTube videos and some good coffee to really unwind and equip the saints for the ministry that's required. And I don't, there's a few books here and there out there. People have recognized the need and have written on it, but that still is not going to be anywhere close to what a community needs to do if they want to walk into the next generation in a different kind of way.
Right, and it's multiple stages because not only do we need to be talking about and teaching these things from a pulpit, from the pastoral level, but then we need to be able to teach and equip and disciple parents, because
Yes,
parents
for
need to be
sure.
having these conversations with their kids. That, I mean, the church, and in hearing it from the pulpit, should be a supplement to what the parents are doing in the home, because
Yes.
the parents are the primary shepherd of their kids, and that's who the kids are with every day. And not only the parents living those things out and just kind of having those conversations, but then also being very intentional, because again, as you and I mentioned earlier, if we aren't teaching our kids, the culture will teach our kids, and what the culture is teaching is rubbish, as you said.
Yeah, for sure. Right. And you said it really well again, is that to equip the parents for the ministry would be the right way to do it. And I'm sure that you, as a young mom, are among bazillions of families, right? That would hunger for that kind of equipping. And
Mm.
I mean, EJ, I teach this stuff week in and week out, and sometimes I come home with my own 5 kids. And I'm like, eh, mm, z- but I don't have, I don't even know what to say for sure. It's such a tough thing, right? And so
Mhm.
I to think we could do again like a retreat or a 6 week small group study or something. Like, we really need a really intense systematic time together. And I do, but But most people are pretty intelligent, and most people really care, and most people really want to do these things. I think there's a great hunger for this kind of opportunity for young families to really move forward.
I think there's a hunger too, and I'm pretty sure that it was Barna, but I don't have it right in front of me. I remember that this was probably 7 years ago now. They had noticed a correlation between basically young people are leaving the church, and we've known that for a while,
Sure.
and people in general are leaving the church, but specifically, especially young people, and they posited that it's actually the churches who look the most like the culture that are dying.
Yes, for
Because
sure.
if kids, young adults are hearing the same things at church that they could hear on Netflix or on YouTube out in the culture, it's like, why go? You could just sit at home on the couch and watch something versus going to the church, and maybe for the fellowship, maybe for the relationships, but it's really the churches who are standing firm and saying something that's cultural. Those are the churches that are thriving.
Yeah.
And they were specifically looking at young people. I think it was like 18, because you see that drop off, right? When you graduate, either graduate confirmation or graduate high school, and then you're not seen in the church again until you're like in your mid 30s. But they were looking at that specific group of people, and what they picked up on is those that age demographic just aren't interested in church because it looks like the same thing as everything else they see.
Yeah, you're so right. I'm watching Stranger Things right now
Mm.
for the 3 seasons with my 19-year-old daughter, right? And I was skeptical going in. There's no way this can be any good, but being a kid of the '80s and just sort of the drama of the
Mhm.
episode, it's incredibly well done. I'm not going to say that it's not without its moral stuff, because of course it is as well. But it's the point of saying that is that there is no chance any church that I've ever been a part of, and I've been a part of a lot of them over the years, and I've ministered and consulted. There is no chance that a church could entertain anywhere near as well
Mm.
as Stranger Things can. But the church
Mhm.
tries, and it tries to get its message through the same way that
Yeah.
these mediums do. And yet
Mhm.
it almost looks just silly at the end of the
Yeah.
day. But you know what Stranger Things can't do? It can't break the power of sin and death in our life.
Mm.
And it can't
Mm.
equip people for how to be the children of light in the midst of this present darkness. And it can't bring those things through the realm of the spirit of love and joy and peace and patience and all of that kind of stuff. Stranger Things has no capability of dealing with the things that really matter. And so when we dumb ourselves down and try to become that in an effort to be relevant or whatever we want to say with our skinny jeans and our tattoos, and that's fine. I mean, get your whatever. But when that's we see as relevance, right? Relevance is that no, the power of sin and death has been broken. That's relevant. Let's learn how to walk in that as people. And the church, as you've just said, historically has always functioned at its very best when it's countercultural.
Yeah, we need the ragamuffin gospel, right?
Totally. Thank you.
That's what
Yes.
we
Brennan
have.
Manning. Absolutely. I love
Yes.
that. Yes.
So what you made me think of was the name of our podcast is Freedom Families, and because we want to be family oriented, and freedom not for licentiousness, but freedom from sin,
Yeah.
freedom, the liberty to do what we ought, like Lord Acton said. We need to realize that a heroin addict is not actually free. A pornography addict is not actually free. There is this movement in our culture that says if we just liberate ourselves, if we just allow ourselves to do whatever we want, there are no boundaries, there are no rules, that's what freedom is. But that's not freedom. You are
Right.
you are a slave to your passions, a slave to your flesh, a slave to sin,
Mm.
but Jesus comes and frees us from that. So what I want to do with this podcast is go at all the important topics that are going on and really look at what scripture tells us and seek truth so that we can have freedom in all areas of our lives, not just for ourselves as individuals, but then for our marriages and for our families. And then I want to build a community of families who are all looking for that same thing, all with the bedrock of Christ.
Yeah. I think that what you're describing is an expression of the remedy on behalf of the future, and a real one, not a backlashing remedy that was the feminism of the '80s and '90s. And again, understandable given the way women were treated. But you're talking about the kind of remedy that can begin to bring that authentic place of peace. And the idea that you would know the truth and the truth will set you free. It's not the idea of being familiar with certain doctrines that Jesus is talking about there. It's the idea of being intimately familiar with the ways of life of the kingdom of shalom that you begin to walk in. And in that place, there is such utter freedom of the soul, right? There, the chains and the bonds have been thrown off, and you're living a different kind of way of life, that the masquerading freedoms of our world that are actually, as you said, bringing greater bondage and greater pain. That's where there's such confusion for people. They think
Mhm.
they're walking towards freedom when actually they're tightening the chains. And to live out a community of families that are learning the ways of the kingdom, and not just learning them, but really walking and expressing them as co-conspirators with God, right? In this whole
Mhm.
thing,
Mhm.
that really is the foundation of the future. I would suggest that can shine God's light in this world, and I think people are hungry for that kind of witness bearing. It's an entirely different way of bearing witness to the kingdom, and I think it's really important.
Well, amen. I think that's a great spot to end, and I just want to thank you again, Peter, for coming on. This was a great conversation, and I hope that you come back and we can maybe flesh out more specifically one of the things we touched on today.
That sounds great, EJ. Thanks for the invitation. Anytime.